What's up, everyone? Today what we're going to do is explore the connections between Jonathan Edwards and Presbyterianism. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there are two great biographies of Jonathan Edwards. One is done by George Marsden. It's called Jonathan Edwards, A Life. And the other is called Jonathan Edwards, A New Biography by Ian Murray, published by Banner of Truth. I just reread the latter. I've reread both of them a couple of different times. And every time I read through the life of Edwards, something sticks out to me as worthy of further exploration. In this case, as I read through Ian Murray's book, I was looking at all of the connections between Jonathan Edwards and Presbyterianism. Now, as you know, Jonathan Edwards was not a Presbyterian. He was actually a Congregationalist. But myself being a Presbyterian minister, all of those interactions and connections between Edwards and Presbyterianism I found to be very, very interesting. And so, of course, I started to take some notes on this concept, and the fruit of that study is going to be this particular video. If you're new to this channel, what's up, everybody? My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We're a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. Love for you to come check us out in real life at some point. Gospel Fellowship has services at 8:30 and 11, Sunday school in between 9:45 on the Lord's Day. I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. Love for you to come be a part of education, get some seminary training, rpts.edu. Highly recommended, best seminary there is as far as I'm concerned for training Reformed pastors and Reformed theological education. All right. So if you're new to this channel, and probably you're not, maybe some of you have been here before, I trust, I have two books on Jonathan Edwards that I do want to recommend. The first is my own, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity. The second is my other one on Jonathan Edwards' resolutions. Now, neither of these concepts come into focus too terribly much in this particular video, because again, we're going to be looking at Jonathan Edwards' connections with Presbyterianism, but I just point those out if you're interested in the Venn diagram of my personal works plus Jonathan Edwards studies. There you go. Those would be two resources for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share screen here, and we're going to look at this heat map of the connections between Edwards and Presbyterianism. And in this heat map, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 6 different areas. First of all, we're going to consider Jonathan Edwards and his relationship with the Westminster Confession of Faith over here. We're going to look at this. Then we're going to look at Jonathan Edwards' vocation. Then we're going to look at Jonathan Edwards and Scotland, the Synod of Philadelphia here in America, key connections of Presbyterianism, and then, of course, his Hampshire Association. All of these things draw Edwards into the conversation regarding Presbyterianism, although, again, he's technically a Congregationalist. Now, why do we say that Edwards is a Congregationalist? Well, because his church, the Northampton Church, of which he served for most of his pastoral professional life, was Congregational in form. As a matter of fact, under Solomon Stoddard, his grandfather, who was the pastor before Edwards was the pastor at the church, they sort of let the office of the ruling elder go away. Unfortunately, the last ruling elder at the Northampton Church died at about the same time that Solomon Stoddard himself died. And so Edwards inherited a church from his grandfather, which did not have ruling elders, though they did have deacons. There was some desire on Edwards' part to sort of re-up the office of the ruling elder, but that did not happen. And although Edwards' church was not part of a formal presbytery, like, for instance, the Presbyterian Church and the Synod of Philadelphia or so forth, he was, though, part of the Hampshire Association, which we're going to look at here, which is proto-Presbyterian in its desire to have connectionalism. So let's go through each one of these things, and we're going to point out the ways that we might consider Jonathan Edwards to be Presbyterian-ish, although he's obviously Congregational in terms of his technical ecclesiastical polity. Okay, so first thing we want to do is look at Edwards' connection with the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, if we're looking for a standard definition of Presbyterianism, it's hard to go wrong with the starting point of doctrine. Presbyterians are Calvinistic by definition, and of course they are confessional, meaning that Presbyterians subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. I suppose it's technically possible to have a Presbyterian church that subscribed to a different confession of faith, and some of our, for instance, Reformed friends, our Reformed Church Association type friends, they would have the three forms of unity with Heidelberg, the Belgic, and the Synod of Dort. But Typically, we call those as Reformed churches, not Presbyterian churches. Presbyterianism tends to come from Scotland for the most part, and most Presbyterian churches do subscribe formally to the Westminster Confession. So the first thing we could do is we could start off with an interesting through line of whether or not Edwards' theology lines up with what's taught in the Westminster Divines, or the Westminster Assembly and its documents. So of course, you probably already know this, and maybe I'm telling you something very obvious, that when the Westminster Assembly met in the 1640s, between 1643 and 1648, they produced a number of documents, including the Westminster Confession of Faith, the main confession, the larger catechism, the shorter catechism, a public directory of worship, and a couple other things that are a little bit lesser known. So did Edwards have any affiliation with these documents? And if so, what did he think about them? Well, when we look at Edwards in relation to the Westminster Confession of Faith, we can say a couple of things that are very interesting, which indicate to me that he would have been probably a very good Presbyterian if he was one. First, Edwards was taught the Westminster Shorter Catechism by his father, Timothy Edwards. Now, his father, Timothy Edwards, he was a Congregationalist minister as well, as Edwards would become one. He was also a chaplain, and in his home, he took family worship and discipleship and catechism of his children very seriously. So he taught Edwards the Shorter Catechism of Westminster from the time he was young. So while Jonathan Edwards lived under the tutelage of his father, he would have been learning the Shorter Catechism constantly, all the time. Family devotions, evening prayers. They would have been going over these things. We know that for a fact because Edwards basically, we might say, fell in love with the Westminster Shorter Catechism and never departed from it for the rest of his life. So when Edwards moved on to Yale to study for his bachelor's degree and his master's degree, it was also a regular part of collegiate life for the undergraduates to be studying and mastering the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Now, I say the Shorter Catechism, but of course, the whole concept of Westminster doctrine was just running through the blood. It was running in the ethos. It was in the air at Yale College where Edwards was studying. And of course, practically everybody in the colonies who was conservative, Calvinistic, Bible-believing Christian was very familiar with the Westminster Confession of Faith and other standards. But it does seem that there was a strong love for and affinity to the Shorter Catechism, probably because it's easy to memorize, it's doctrinally succinct, and it gives these wonderful definitions of things like justification, adoption, sanctification, and so forth. So all of the undergraduates were expected to master the Shorter Catechism, and they would have had to stand in the college hall and give recitations of the Shorter Catechism to establish that they've mastered these things. Now, after Edwards graduated and he began to have his own children, it's not surprising then to notice that he taught his own children the Shorter Catechism too. And again, we know from Edwards's biography as well as his writings and so forth that he taught his children the Shorter Catechism. So not only did he learn it from his father, Timothy Edwards, but he passed it on to their children. Now, here's something really interesting, and we're going to talk more about the Hampshire Association in just a moment. But let me just first of all say that the Hampshire Association was a somewhat informal, but I guess it's more than informal, is a regionalized association of churches of which Edwards's church, the Northampton Church, and again, that of Solomon Stoddard before him, it was part of a regional gathering of churches. They called themselves the Hampshire Association. And in 1732, they formally adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith as something like a doctrinal litmus test for the ministers that were going to come into that association. So that sounds very Presbyterian. That's what we Presbyterians do. When we ordain a person or we license them to preach as Presbyterians, we test them against the Westminster Confession. We even ask for whether or not they have any exceptions and things like that. I'm not sure they went through all that formal process of doing exceptions, but the Hampshire Association did accept the Westminster Confession of Faith as something like their doctrinal standard, and we know that Edwards voted in favor of doing that very thing. So that sounds very Presbyterian. And later on in Edwards' life, and again, the purpose of this video is not necessarily to give a chronological biography of Edwards. I've done that in other videos. But after Edwards was dismissed from the Northampton Church and he took up his missionary endeavors at Stockbridge, one of the interesting things is that when Edwards came in, taking over for John Sargent, the previous missionary there at Stockbridge, Edwards moved from using a different catechism to the Westminster Shorter Catechism, indicating again that when he was going to teach the English and the Indian congregations doctrine, his preference was to teach the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Okay? Finally, and we're going to actually look at this a little bit later in this presentation, Edwards told John Erskine that he could easily receive the Westminster Confession of Faith as his doctrinal standard if he were to go to Scotland to become a pastor there. Now, we'll talk more about that in a little bit of time. So all of that to say that if Edwards was considered quasi-Presbyterian, we wouldn't notice a whole lot of doctrinal difference between him and the Westminster Standards. Now, of course, this never happened, but wouldn't it be amazing if we could go back in a time machine and we could have Edwards go through the Westminster Confession and tell us whether or not he had any exceptions to Westminster doctrine? That would be an interesting exercise. Unfortunately, he didn't do that. And for the most part, when Edwards is writing his treatises and when Edwards is preaching his sermons, he does not refer to the confession or any creed for that matter. Edwards would preach sermons that would focus on the text, the doctrine, and then the application, but it was very uncommon for Edwards to cite any other sources like Calvin or confessions or creeds or anything like that. He just didn't tend to do that sort of thing. So it would be a wonderful historical exercise to know where Edwards would have disagreed with the Westminster Confession of Faith. But for the most part, what we can say to the positive is that Edwards really believed in the Shorter Catechism and thought that that was the best way to teach doctrine, as evidenced by the number of times that he used that throughout his ministry. Okay? So that perfectly aligns with Edwards for the most part. Now, the second thing that we could do is we could look at Edwards in terms of his vocation. So was he actually a Presbyterian pastor? Well, we've already answered that question to the negative, and we've said that Edwards was congregational, at least as it relates to the Northampton Church, which he pastored between 1727 and his dismissal in 1750. So for those 23 years, Edwards pastored a Congregationalist church. But hold on just a moment, because that's not exactly the full story. There are some other moments where Edwards's vocational interests came into alignment with Presbyterianism directly. So when we look at his vocational life, the first thing we can say is that Edwards actually was a Presbyterian in 1722 when he took his first church, basically as something like a licentiate or an unordained supply preacher or interim pastor, pulpit supply, we might call it. Jonathan Edwards was Presbyterian. In fact, his first call was to a Presbyterian church in New York City. Now, this is in what I call the early pastoral ministry time of Jonathan Edwards. He's going to do a couple of different things. He's going to pastor this church in New York for a short time. He's going to very briefly take up a church in Bolton that does not work out for him. And he's also going to be a tutor at Yale. But he was a Presbyterian pastor during this time. He went out to help a church split that had split between the English and the Scots-Irish contingents. The Scots-Irish contingent was a little bit more Presbyterian-leaning than the other, and they had some falling out, and Edwards goes out to New York City, and he works with one of those factions, and he basically did such a good job that the church was able to reunite. Okay, so while he was never fully ingratiated into the Presbytery of New York or Philadelphia or any others for that matter, he was technically a Presbyterian pastor for that time of being pulpit supply in that church. Okay. Now, there's another interesting moment a little bit later after Edwards' dismissal, and again, this is not a fully biographical sketch here chronologically, but after Edwards was dismissed from the Northampton Church over the communion controversy, in 1751, the Presbyterians in Virginia, who loved Edwards' revivalistic writings, New Side, New Light Presbyterians in favor of the revival, expressly asked Jonathan Edwards to come be a Presbyterian minister. In fact, there's a letter by Samuel Davies who wrote Jonathan Edwards and basically said, please come be a Presbyterian pastor in Virginia. Our people here would love you. Your theology fits exactly with what we're trying to do down here in the Middle Colonies. And so there was almost a sense in which Edwards could have taken up a Presbyterian church here in this moment. Unfortunately, fortunately, let's say for the sake of God's sovereign plan, God's sovereign over all things, the letter of invitation really didn't get to Jonathan Edwards in time because he had already been a little bit too far down the line to take the Stockbridge missionary outpost call. In fact, by the time that Edwards heard of Samuel Davies' offer to come be a Presbyterian pastor in Virginia, they would have loved him, he said, but Edwards had already taken too many steps to go to Stockbridge. So one wonders how his life could or would have been different if he had taken up that call in the Virginias, but sadly that was not to be the case. Now, swinging back full circle, so we mentioned he was Presbyterian for a time in this short little pastorate in New York City. Swinging all the way back to the end of his life, he does take up the presidency of Princeton, which is a Presbyterian institution. Okay, so as it goes, we have Harvard, who's first originally the seminary, but as it goes a little bit to the left, then Yale kind of comes along and fills that void, and as it gets to be taken up in a little bit more Enlightenment, Arminian inclinations, then Princeton, the College of New Jersey, takes up the next flagship position as the standard Presbyterian conservative Calvinistic institution. And because it is overtly Presbyterian for the most part, we could say here that Jonathan Edwards was, again, aligned with a Presbyterian vocational ministry. Okay, so for the most part, if you would ask him, let's say you had a microphone and you said, "Hey, Jonathan Edwards, what denomination are you?" He would say Congregational. He probably would not have said Presbyterian, but it's at least interesting that at two places in his life, and almost potentially a third, he could have officially been Presbyterian by vocation. Okay, next, let's go back and let's revisit that Hampshire Association because it's just too interesting to let go. So here in the Hampshire Association, we have to kind of define what this was, because I should be honest and say that this was an attempt, at least, to make their congregational polity much more like that the Presbyterians had. Now, the founders of the Hampshire Association were these two men here, Solomon Stoddard, that's Jonathan Edwards' maternal grandfather, and William Williams, who's also an extended family member. These two men and a couple others were called sometimes the Connecticut River Gods, lowercase g, because of their great influence. If the Mathers family, Increase and Samuel and Richard Mather in Boston, were sort of the preeminent, most influential divines on the East Coast, the Connecticut River Gods of Solomon Stoddard and William Williams were the most influential people inland. Now, today we might not think of Northampton as being very far inland, but in those days, we're still talking kind of a frontier context here. What they wanted to do was have an association of churches that would work together in concert to do certain things. And so the first thing that Solomon Stoddard and William Williams wanted was that their churches, at least their pastors thereof, would meet together 3 or 4 times a year, which they did. So they began meeting together, and I'm going to show you a map of these churches here in just a moment. But they met for a number of really important purposes. First, they did want to work on ordinations to make sure that guys that are being ordained were going to be standard and were going to be reliable. And this is a bit of a controversy at times, including the Robert Breck controversy, who they did not think should have been ordained in their area, in the Hampshire Association ministry bounds. But for the most part, it was just a way of substantiating the calls of other ministers and validating them as worthy men who are commendable and honorable and worthy to sit under their teaching. They would sometimes, too, though, take up theological questions, and at their meetings, they would take up a particular doctrinal question, and they would propound that question for everybody's mutual edification. So, by way of example, at least one time they took up the question of the unforgivable sin, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, and they took a meeting to talk about that, to sort of tease out some pastoral implications and to make sure that they're all in agreement on their doctrine on that particular topic. Now, again, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the Westminster Confession, and if you kind of go back to my heat map, you can see all the interconnectivities here. But the Hampshire Association did ascribe then formally to the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1732. And again, this makes this association look very much like something like a Presbyterian system, okay? More to that same point, this would be something that Edwards would depend upon. This date here is backwards. This should be 1758, not 1785. Edwards did not live that long. Sorry about that. Little typo there. Edwards did depend on councils for advice from time to time, especially in 1750 when he was really considering what to do after he got fired. Part of the firing process was to consult church councils with representatives from Hampshire Association churches. But then Edwards would a couple different times throw himself into the advisement of such a council for direction in his life. So when he was trying to figure out what to do after he got fired, he had a council give him some advice. And then too, also in 1758, again, that number's backwards here, he once again took up a council to advise him whether or not he should take the call to Princeton Seminary to become their president. So Edwards thought quite a bit of church councils and associations, and that makes him quite Presbyterian in the way that he thinks. Okay, so here's a map of the Hampshire Association, and I should tell you that Boston's over here under my chin. But here's the Hampshire Association. We can see the Connecticut River. Here's the Northampton Church right here. And here's a few others. Here's Springfield. Here's Enfield down here where Jonathan Edwards preaches sinners in the hands of an angry God. This would be the Hampshire Association churches up and down the river valley there. Now, Edwards will write on this topic a couple different times. For instance, in miscellany number RR, an early miscellany for Edwards, he says, "Who can deny but that ministers may take each other's advice, or may meet together for that purpose, and may be congregated together for the advancement of the kingdom of Christ? Whoever holds more than this does hold that men have power to make laws for the conscience." Okay, so Edwards thinks that it's a good idea to do this, but it sounds like he's a little bit concerned, though, that these things would go too far and have power over the conscience, which Edwards is probably reacting there to something like prelacy or Erastianism, where bishops would have too much control, and obviously he would be opposed to that. But he certainly thinks that ministers can voluntarily get together in these types of associations to do good things together and for the purpose of mutual edification and support. Okay. He also says this: "Is it unreasonable to suppose that there is no cause that can arise in the church too hard for a particular minister or a particular congregation, and that there should be no need in no case of any resort or appeal or referring to the cause of a higher judgment?" In other words, what Edward says here is, yeah, actually that does happen, that there are moments where something is too difficult for a particular minister, and what he ought to do is go together to other ministers in something like an informal association for advice and counsel, the very thing that Edwards himself is going to personally do at least twice in his life, okay? And next, then, after we looked at the Westminster Confession and we've looked at his relationship to the Hampshire Association, it's good for us then to think about Edwards's key Presbyterian connections. And this is, again, what stuck out to me in reading Ian Murray's biography again, is how many of them there were. I'm going to mention 5 or so of these Presbyterian connections, but there were probably too many to really detail in a video like this. So let's take up that next question and ask, who are Edwards's Presbyterian friends? Well, we've got at least 5 that are really significant, and more than that. So first, we want to mention David Brainerd, the missionary. Brainerd was definitely a Presbyterian ordained minister, and though there was some controversy related to Brainerd's ordination because of something that he said when he was at Yale, he got expelled, and it was really hard for him to get ordained afterwards, but he ends up being sent out by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge and licensed to preach by the Presbytery. I believe it was New York, if I'm not mistaken on that. David Brainerd becomes Edwards' friend. David Brainerd will come and convalesce in Edwards' own home. Eventually, he's going to die of tuberculosis. There's some rumor that he might have fallen in love with Jonathan Edwards' daughter, Jerusha. Some people entirely dismiss that. I do think that there is some there, enough at least to make it interesting. But, of course, Jonathan Edwards is then going to take David Brainerd's journals and he's going to turn them into what ended up being his best-selling work during his own lifetime, The Life and Diary of David Brainerd, which Edwards is the editor of. Still a great book and very greatly used by God to inspire other people to go out and to do similarly for the cause of missions and evangelism, not limited to Native Americans, but also to the whole of the world. So there's a key Presbyterian connection. Gilbert Tennant is also another major Presbyterian connection. Now, One thing about Gilbert Tennent, he's sort of the Presbyterian version of Edwards, the Congregationalist, and George Whitefield, the Anglican. These three are three of the major pieces of the Great Awakening revival. It's hard to pin a moment where Gilbert Tennent and Edwards are in the same room, though. I think it happened, and there's a couple different occasions where they probably met, but we can't say that for sure. But we do know that Edwards is very familiar with Gilbert Tennent and his brother William Tennent Jr. and his father William Tennent Sr., who was the one who basically instituted the log college model of training ministers for the ministry, especially associated with those New Light or New Side Presbyterians that are pro-revivalist in their orientation. Okay, so here's what we might say is a colleague or a fellow revivalist. Certainly they had mutuals, no question about that, George Whitefield not being the least of them. And we know that Edwards is very aware of the Tennents and what they're doing to the east. Aaron Burr Sr., I would love to do personally more study in the life of Aaron Burr Sr. He's a Presbyterian minister. He's also going to be the president of the College of New Jersey or Princeton before Edwards takes that role. He'll also become Jonathan Edwards' son-in-law because Aaron Burr Sr. is going to marry Esther Burr, Jonathan Edwards' daughter. And they're going to give birth to Aaron Burr Jr., who you're probably thinking of in the Alexander Hamilton duel, also became vice president of the United States. Well, Aaron Burr Sr. is a Presbyterian minister, and it's a letter of correspondence between Burr and Jonathan Edwards, to which Edwards writes his personal narrative, which is an amazing short work. If you haven't read this, you really should. Go check it out in edwards.yale.edu in volume 16 of Edwards' works, his personal narrative written to Aaron Burr Sr. And we're going to see Aaron Burr come back in just a minute here, hang out with me just a little bit longer. Samuel Buell, another Presbyterian minister. This is a student that comes to study under Jonathan Edwards in his home. He'll eventually become a colleague of Edwards, and Edwards is going to actually trust Buell to take over his own pulpit at Northampton while Edwards is out itinerating during the time of the Great Awakening. So when Edwards goes out to preach in the Great Awakening, he has Samuel Buell come in to pastor the Northampton church. And somewhat ironically, Buell has great success and revival really sparks fire at Northampton. One of the people most impressed by Samuel Buell's preaching is Jonathan Edwards' own wife, Sarah, who really falls into an ecstatic state of spiritual revival in her own heart during the preaching of Samuel Buell. So that's cool. And then finally, John Erskine is Edwards' most esteemed colleague who's Presbyterian in Scotland. And these two are going to correspond very regularly. In fact, in volume 16 of Edwards' works, there's at least 14 letters from Edwards to Erskine corresponding back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, in which Erskine wants to know about the revivals, Edwards wants to know what's going on in Europe, and so these two are going to become very good friends by way of letter correspondence, okay? So one of the things that we see here that's obvious then is that Edwards had a ton of Presbyterian connections, and he was very much in the inner workings of the Presbyterian world, okay? Next, let's dial in on Scotland here for just a moment, having mentioned John Erskine, and of course, we think of the Church of Scotland as being one of the hallmark Presbyterian main denominations, okay, establishment denominations, Presbyterian. Now, the Church of Scotland obviously waxes and wanes over time, and it goes back and forth and has better moments and worser moments. But for the most part, when we think of Presbyterianism, we think of Scottish Presbyterianism as sort of the major exemplar of the same, okay? Now, what can we say about Edwards' relationship to Scotland? Well, first, we just said something of his 14 letters back and forth with John Erskine, but Erskine is also going to take up posthumously to publish some of Jonathan Edwards' writings. So Edwards only published some of his stuff during his own lifetime, and others of his stuff is going to come out later. Well, John Erskine is so impressed with Jonathan Edwards as a theologian and as a revivalist, sharing so many interests between the two, that he himself is going to push for Edwards' works to be promoted and published, even at a time where Edwards' brand of Calvinistic revivalism is sort of falling out of favor. Okay, so John Erskine is something like a hero promoter of Edwards after Edwards' death. More to that point, we've mentioned the date 1750 a number of times because it's such a crisis moment in Edwards' life, probably the crisis moment. But John Erskine also likewise made a push for Edwards to come out to Scotland to be a Presbyterian minister there. We mentioned previously that Samuel Davies wanted Edwards to come down to Virginia to be a Presbyterian minister in the Middle Colonies, but John Erskine also pushed for Edwards to come all the way out. Well, what held him back from doing so? In the Davies letter case, it was the ironic moment in history, just didn't get the letter in time. He'd already taken up in Stockbridge. But with Erskine, the problem was that Edwards was very concerned with his having a huge family, 10 kids, right? A lot of responsibility. It would just be too much to move across the Atlantic at this particular stage of his life. So Edwards was hesitant to do that. But when we look at Edwards' published writings during his lifetime, one of the other things that we can say is that the Scots really liked his stuff, okay? And they end up becoming something like the preserver of Jonathan Edwards' theological legacy. So whereas, ironically, again, a prophet's never without honor except in his hometown, right? Edwards' works are more highly treasured and favored across the sea over in Scotland than they were here in the colonies. And so the Scots valued Edwards' theological contributions probably more than his own people ever did. Okay, so Edwards does have quite a bit of connection with Presbyterian Scotland. Finally, the most interesting thing, and this again stuck out to me as I was reading Ian Murray's biography published by Banner of Truth. I'll post a link to this in the description of this video. Edwards does actually attend the Synod of Philadelphia on at least a couple of occasions. Now, that's really interesting. So Edwards was particularly keen to actually go and participate with Presbyterian polity. Now, hopefully you know this about Presbyterianism, that there are various levels. The local level is the session of the church, and then the regional level is the presbytery. A bigger region is a synod or synod, and then the greatest region is the General Assembly. Well, Edwards went to visit the Synod of Philadelphia at least twice. Okay, in fact, I love this. He actually preached at the synod. So they thought, the Presbyterians did, so highly of Jonathan Edwards that they actually invited him to come and to be a synod preacher, which he did in 1752. He preached one of his great sermons, True Grace Distinguished from the Experience of Devils, and he was featured as a Synod of Philadelphia Presbyterian keynote speaker. Today, when we have General Assembly or synods, we still have these sort of keynote speakers that give the main addresses before the business. Synods and presbyteries have worship before they do their business, and Edwards was so thought well of that he actually was the preacher in 1752. We also know for a fact that in 1755, he went with Aaron Burr again to the Synod of Philadelphia to be a participant and an observer. Now, he would not have had official voting delegate status, again, because his ties were informal and not formal with the Presbyterians. But I think that that really shows a growing interest in Jonathan Edwards in relationship to Presbyterian polity. Now, let's read a couple of quotes and then we're out for this video. Edwards says here, you are pleased, dear sir, this is his letter to John Erskine I mentioned, very kindly to ask me whether I could sign the Westminster Confession of Faith and submit to the Presbyterian form of church government, and to offer to use your influence to procure a call for me to some congregation in Scotland. I should be very ungrateful if I were not thankful for such kindness and friendship. Now he's going to answer the question. As to my subscribing to the substance of the Westminster Confession, there would be no difficulty. And as to the Presbyterian governments, I have long been perfectly out of conceit with our own unsettled, independent, confused way of church government in this land. Now, notice that this letter is in 1750, the year that he gets fired, so of course he's going to be a little bit upset about congregational polity right now. It just burned him, basically. And the Presbyterian way has ever appeared to me to be most reasonable, agreeable to the Word of God, and the reason and nature of things, though I cannot say that I think that the Presbyterian government of the Church of Scotland is so perfect that it can't in some respects be amended. It should be amended. Sorry for the spelling mistake. Or maybe it is just mended. Yeah, just mended, fixed. That's what it means. Yeah, mended is fine. So all that to say that Edwards does say, yeah, I think I would actually make a pretty good Presbyterian. I could definitely subscribe to the Westminster Confession. And I think that Presbyterian government is basically better than the sort of fly by the seat of your pants congregationalism that just burned me so bad. But I don't think that it's so perfect that we couldn't tweak it a bit to fix it up just a little bit. Okay? So when we look at this heat map of Jonathan Edwards' connections then with Presbyterianism, it seems obvious that he's almost there. It's almost circumstance and happenstance that he isn't Presbyterian, especially when he could have been in 1750 under a number of different angles. But nevertheless, sadly, we must say that Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist minister, as much as it pains me to say that. But at least as it relates his relation to the Confession, vocation, Scotland, the Synod, key connections in the Hampshire Association, which was a proto-presbytery, I think it's still fair that we can claim him as our own. All right, well, that's it for this particular video. Again, don't forget, grab that Ian Murray biography, maybe even the Marsden one too, if you want really good biographies on Jonathan Edwards. But if you're interested in some of my works, my book, A Theology of Joy, is there. I'll post that in the description as well as my book on his resolutions. You might find those very interesting as well. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.